Resurrection City Church. My name is Angela, and I am super excited and also humbled to be with you here today. So before I introduce myself further, I want to extend a special welcome if you're new or visiting with us today. I'm super glad you're here. And also if you're watching online, shout out to my sister and others. I'm thankful to have you visiting us online too. So just a quick note before we get started, you can follow along if you'd like on the slides by going to rescitychurch.org/slides. All right, so since I'm typically not the one you see on stage, I'm going to start off by introducing myself a little bit more. And today's sermon is about work, so I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about my work, and I'm going to make you wait another minute for the cute picture of my child that's obligatory for a guest speaker. By day, I am a marketing manager for 3M's healthcare business. And we're actually now a separate company as of 2 weeks ago called Solventum. I personally work in the dental and orthodontic business. Now, you might be saying, I didn't know 3M made dental and orthodontic products. But if you've ever had a crown, a filling, or even just your teeth cleaned or braces, you probably have had 3M dental products in your mouth if your dentist was a good dentist. So I work with a team of some really incredible people, and this is a photo of some of them. I spend most of my days on Microsoft Teams or Zoom meetings, and I do go to the office about once a week, or sometimes get a chance to go to California with my coworkers, like in this photo. Most days, I really like my job. Some days, I'm sure like all of you, I don't always like it. And we'll get more into what work means to me in a little bit here. So around 4:30 each afternoon, I hop off my last Teams meeting, and I go to pick up Ethan. I don't pick up Ted sometimes. He takes care of himself. But this is Ethan. Ted and I have loved parenting him for about 2 years now. Around here at Res City, he's lovingly referred to as Baby Ethan, and he's a full-on toddler now, so I think the kids are going to have to come up with a new name for him. But we live in North St. Paul. We spend a lot of our free time at parks, going on walks, and hanging out with our community group, family, and friends. So today we're here to talk about work. I'm going to start by sharing a little bit about what today's sermon is not going to be about. And that is, it's not going to be a full-on kind of theology of work, like full head knowledge about why work matters to God. I think Joel did a really good job of describing some of that in the Commissioning Sunday part we had here. And there are already a lot of awesome resources on that subject that are available. So these are 3 of my personal favorites, books that cover the theology of work well. Garden City by John Mark Comer, Every Good Endeavor by Tim Keller, and Work Matters by Tom Nelson. So if you're looking to learn more about the theology of work, I definitely recommend checking one of those out. But in short, God created work to be a good thing. Like all things, work is fallen and broken, and we are all part of God's redemptive plan for work in the world. As we do our work every day, we bring about flourishing and participate in the ultimate redemption of all things that God will bring about when Jesus comes again. So I'm not going to go into the rest of a theology of work sermon, but when I think about this series that we're in today, it's called Ordinary Faith, and it's about the ordinary aspects of our day-to-day lives and where God plays into those. And one thing I've noticed about work is it just keeps happening. Every day we go to work. And so my team at work has gotten really into this quote that I think is hilarious, and it says, if we can just get through this month, we only have one more month to go before we need to get through another month. And so that has kind of been a bit of a theme of our team. There's a lot that happens at work every day, and it kind of feels like it just keeps going on. Unless you're retired or you're on vacation, we go to work most days. And if you're a student, you might feel the same way about your classes. There's just one more paper, one more test, kind of it just keeps happening. It might feel like you're building something up, and then it gets torn down, and you have to build it back up again. So I'll give a couple of examples of what that might look like. Say you work in healthcare, like Brett, who gave the healthcare prayer earlier. You have a patient who's in the hospital bed. You finally help them heal and go home. And then sure enough, another patient shows up and takes their bed the next day. Maybe you're a teacher. I know there's several teachers at Res City. You work with your class to build skills and knowledge throughout the whole year. And then they go away on summer break, and you know that another teacher is going to have to build that back up the next year. Maybe you're an engineer, a software engineer, and you build a piece of code, and it breaks, and then you have to fix it. We're all what I would call builders and rebuilders in our work on a day-to-day basis. And that can be super energizing. It gives us a new challenge all the time to keep going, but it can also be really ordinary and feel like a bit of a slog. So the good news is that literally everyone in the Bible also worked. So I had every single Bible story to choose from for this sermon. But the one that came to mind for me first is the story of Nehemiah. And that's because Nehemiah worked in literal building and rebuilding of things. His work involved rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem, which we'll get into a little bit later. So today we're going to dive into the story of Nehemiah and what we can learn about God and what it looks like to build and rebuild alongside of him. So first, we'll share a little bit of historical context for the story of Nehemiah. This book takes place around 445 BC, and this was 150 years after the city of Jerusalem was taken off into exile by the Babylonians. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah, which are now back-to-back in our modern Bible, were originally one book, and they were about rebuilding several things as they returned from exile. They had to rebuild their temple, they rebuilt their community, and they also rebuilt the city walls. So today we're specifically talking about Nehemiah, which is specifically about rebuilding the walls of the city of Jerusalem. Now, you might be saying to yourself, my city doesn't have walls, and I thought walls around cities were bad, like the Berlin Wall, for instance. And you're right, city walls are definitely not needed in today's day and age. But in the time that this story took place, in 445 BC, a city without walls was defenseless. A big wind could come in and knock down the city or the buildings. Animals could come in and go after all the little children who were playing in the city streets. Opposing groups of people could come in and attack and take the people off into exile again. So for the people of Jerusalem, having a wall for their city was really important to them feeling established as a viable city again. So today we're going to walk through the story of Nehemiah because Nehemiah was familiar with things being torn down and being rebuilt. He knew that this was the work God was calling him to, and yet I'm sure it often felt hard and ordinary. He relied on God, and he saw God show up in his work. So the big idea today is that God is with us in the building and the rebuilding of our day-to-day work. Now, not everything from this sermon is going to resonate with your specific work. I'm obviously coming at this from a place of working in business. You might be in a customer service role or the arts or one of the other types of work we prayed over earlier. You might be a stay-at-home parent, which is absolutely work. I think it's harder than my job. Or you might be unable to work or out of work for a season, and the process of figuring out what's next for you in work might also feel very ordinary and like a slog. So wherever you find yourself with work today, that is absolutely okay. Take the pieces of this message that resonate, hold on to those, and forget about the rest. So we're going to start today by opening in prayer. God, today I thank you that you get it. You were the original worker in that you created the whole world. You made work, you made it good, and yet you know it's broken, and you are redeeming it through the sacrifice of your son, Jesus. I thank you that Jesus not only sacrificed through his death, but also by living a life of work and working just like us as our example. And I thank you for the other examples in the Bible, like Nehemiah, who give us examples of how and why we work. And I pray that you would speak to us today through the story of Nehemiah, which is ultimately your story, God. Amen. All right, so there's going to be a lot of scripture today, just a heads up. If you want to follow along, again, rescitychurch.org/slides. But I will pause throughout and kind of elaborate on what the scripture is telling us. So I'm going to start by reading Nehemiah chapter 1, which sets the stage for this story. And it says, "The words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah, in the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa, Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men. And I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile, and also about Jerusalem. They said to me, 'Those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire.'" All right, so some context for Nehemiah. Nehemiah was working for a guy named King Artaxerxes of Persia in the city of Susa. On this map here, Susa is the black circle on the right. So the Israelites, like I said earlier, had been taken off into captivity by the Babylonians, and then the Babylonians were captured by the Persians under a guy named Cyrus the Great. So Susa was the center of the political power of the Persian Empire. It was several hundred miles east of Jerusalem, so you can see on the map the circle on the left is where Jerusalem is. So Nehemiah's in Susa, that circle on the right, and his job was to be a cupbearer to the king. All right, raise your hand if your job is a cupbearer. Okay, no hands. So a cupbearer sounds like kind of a strange job, but it was actually a really high-ranking official in Nehemiah's day. It was the person who served the king his wine at the royal table. Sounds awesome. Except for that, one of the risky aspects of this job is that the cupbearer had to taste the wine first to make sure it wasn't poisonous. So, bad day at that job, it's probably the end of you. The cupbearer had to be trustworthy and loyal. So Nehemiah is minding his own business, working in Susa as the king's cupbearer in this really well-off job, when these guys come from Jerusalem, and Nehemiah asks them how things are going. The response he gets is what we might refer to as a 21st century fire drill, except for literally this time. The walls of Jerusalem were not only broken, but had literally been burned with fire. So I guess this puts my work fire drills into a little bit of context, since there's not literal fire in mine. But anyways, let's read on to see how Nehemiah responds to this fire drill. So Nehemiah says, "When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. Then I said, 'Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess the sins that we Israelites, including myself and my father's family, have committed against you. We have acted very wickedly toward you. We have not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws you gave your servant Moses. Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man. I was cupbearer to the king." So Nehemiah gets the news of this big challenge that's happened to his people back in Jerusalem. So putting myself in Nehemiah's shoes, I think my response would have been to ask a million questions, call my coworkers, and start figuring out how we were going to solve this problem. But Nehemiah's first inclination instead was to fast and to pray. Wow. I have to say, when I'm faced with a big challenge at work, that's not usually my first inclination. So Nehemiah's prayer can be summarized in a few parts that I have bolded up here on the screen. First, Nehemiah remembers the goodness of God and how he's been so faithful to his covenant over time. Then he confesses the people's sins, and he even includes himself in that confession. He recognizes that sin has gotten them to the point they're in today. And lastly, he asks God to bless his work and to give him success when he goes before the king to ask for the resources he needs. So let's read on. Nehemiah goes to the king with his asks and plans. He recognizes he's in a unique role as a cupbearer, a position of power, and he has a huge opportunity to help his people back in Jerusalem. So reading on, it says, "In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before. So the king asked me, 'Why does your face look so sad when you're not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart.' I was very much afraid, but I said to the king, 'May the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire?' The king said to me, 'Okay, what is it you want?' Then I prayed to the God of heaven." Pause. So Nehemiah is in this conversation with the king, and the king asks him what it is that he wants. And before Nehemiah launches into his ask of everything he needs, he stops and prays to the God of heaven. So I want to pause here and talk about this specific kind of prayer that Nehemiah prays. I call this a speed prayer. This is the prayer when your boss calls you out of the blue and says, "Hey, do you have 5 minutes?" And you say, "Oh, dear God, help me." I think it's so beautiful that God hears these prayers too. It's easy to think about the prayer that Nehemiah prayed back in chapter 1 as something formal, where you sit aside and pray over what's coming up in your work. And I think that's a really beautiful thing. But in the day-to-day of our work, we don't always have time for that. We're in situations like what Nehemiah is in here, where he just quickly prays to the God of heaven. And what I like about this story is that Nehemiah does both. He prays this speed prayer after his more drawn-out prayer back in chapter 1. He took the time to pray over his work in a thoughtful way when he had the time to do so. And I bet having done that prayer before this conversation, he felt more equipped to have it when he was in front of the king in kind of the moment of the battle. So the key takeaway here is that in both senses, Nehemiah's first inclination was to pray. There are many types of prayer that God honors related to our work, and we should pray in various ways as it relates to where we're at in our work in any given day. So let's keep going with the story. All right, so Nehemiah prays, and then we pick up here. He says, "And I answered the king, 'If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried so that I can rebuild it.' And I also said to him, 'If it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah? And may I have a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the royal park, so he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple and for the city wall and the residence I will occupy?' And because the gracious hand of my God was on me, the king granted my requests. So I went to the governors of Trans-Euphrates and gave them the king's letters. And the king had also sent army officers and cavalry with me." All right, so Nehemiah prays, fasts, comes prepared for this conversation, and he knows what he needs to be successful in the rebuilding project. First, he needs the king's permission to leave Susa and go to Jerusalem to lead the project. He also needs letters to the local governors to say that the king supports what Nehemiah is doing. In business, we might call this air cover. So letters that say, "Hey, I'm the king, I support this, let this guy go through." And the king grants Nehemiah's request because God goes with him in the conversation. Again, I think it's easy to see how the prayer and fasting that Nehemiah did back in chapter 1 is time that he was spending with God. But also this time that he's spending in conversation with the king is also time spent with God, doing God's work. So the next time you're in a planning meeting or you're talking to your boss about things you need to be successful, think about Nehemiah and remember that God is with you in those conversations, and he wants to meet you in prayer about them and about your work. So my question for you here is, what is something coming up in your work that you can be praying about now? Maybe it's the repetitive tasks that you do every day that you know are coming up in this week ahead. That sense of building something and then having to rebuild it that we talked about earlier. Maybe it's a difficult relationship with a coworker who you know is scheduled to work with you this week. Prayer recenters us on who God is in the midst of the difficult, ordinary elements of our work. and it prepares us, like Nehemiah, to face those elements of work full of the Holy Spirit. All right, so that's the groundwork for the story of Nehemiah. Nehemiah prays, he gets support for the king, and off goes Nehemiah over to Jerusalem to start the work of rebuilding the wall. All right, so skipping ahead a little bit in the story, Nehemiah gets to Jerusalem, he goes and he scouts out the situation with the walls and what he's up against, and then he gathers a group of the local people living in Jerusalem to rally them to participate in the work with him. And that's where we'll pick up the story here. Nehemiah says, "Then I said to them, 'You see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace.' I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me and what the king had said to me. They replied, 'Let us start rebuilding.' So they began this good work." So I love how Nehemiah rallies the people here. Now remember, Nehemiah was from that royal city of Susa. It would have been natural for him to come in and say, "I'm here to rescue the city of Jerusalem from the trouble you're in." But he doesn't. Instead, Nehemiah takes a posture of empathy and servanthood. He identifies with the people by saying "we" and "us" when he's talking about the suffering they've encountered and the rebuilding that needs to be done. He doesn't command the people to do the rebuilding work, but rather he says that they will do it together. So speaking directly to those of you in any type of leadership role, whether formal or informal in your work, I think this is a really great example of servant leadership. Nehemiah puts himself in a place of being united with the people. He identifies with their pain, and he agrees that they will work through this together. And it works. The people rally around Nehemiah, and they decide to start the work. So next, Nehemiah puts the people to work according to their gifts. Now, I'm going to spare you reading the entirety of Nehemiah chapter 3, which details every section of the wall, who built what and how. But I will read a few verses of it so you can get a flavor. Eliashib the high priest and his fellow priests went to work and rebuilt the sheep gate. They dedicated it and set its doors in place. Uzziel, son of Hariah, one of the goldsmiths, repaired the next section, and Hananiah, one of the perfume makers, made repairs next to that. They restored Jerusalem as far as the broad wall. Raphiah, son of Hur, ruler of a half-district of Jerusalem, repaired the next section. I have no idea how to pronounce those names, but if you'd say it with confidence, no one notices. So one thing I noticed as I read through this text is that there are a variety of different skill sets participating in the work, and I've highlighted them on the screen. So there are priests, who you might think of as today's clergy, Joel's and Julie's. There are goldsmiths and perfume makers, today's business people, tradespeople, people who participate in economic life. And there are rulers, today's government workers or public service workers. It's encouraging to me when I think about the people of God and how my work is part of this body of believers who are all doing God's work in their vocations every day. When I talk with you all at Res City, I love hearing about your jobs and how God has wired you to design aerospace equipment or to wire buildings with electricity, or to partner with refugee families as they come to Minnesota, or to care for babies in the NICU overnight in the hospital. I'm so glad that God has made each of you with your unique skills and gifts that make our world so much more beautiful, vibrant, and flourishing of a place to live. It keeps me going when my work gets mundane and ordinary to know that I'm just one part of a team of all of you and of God's people around our city and the whole world that are doing God's work together. And I'm glad that the church is a place that brings us together, because realistically, our paths wouldn't cross in our day-to-day lives and our day jobs. Just like the people who built the wall with Nehemiah came together to do God's work. So this leads us to our second takeaway, which is that Nehemiah surrounds himself with a team. And my question for you to ask yourself here is, How can you recognize the good work that others around you do every day? So whether or not your coworkers follow God, God definitely has them working with you for a reason. We can be so deeply blessed by good coworkers who we probably spend more time with than our own spouse or roommate a lot of days. We can honor God by recognizing the skills that others around us in our work have been given and by encouraging them in the ways that they use those skills to help us in our work. So this week, I would encourage you to take the time to thank or encourage someone in the way God has wired them for work. And I promise you that by recognizing the value of those around you in your work, your day-to-day will catch just a glimpse of the extraordinary. It will take you out of the ordinary for a minute, because when you make someone else's day, it's a great feeling, and it's a hint of what's to come when all things are redeemed and made right. And around here at Res City, I would love to see us be a congregation that celebrates work. I think we already are with this annual commissioning Sunday. And through our community groups, we often spend time talking about our vocations. So let's be a church that celebrates work and encourages one another in how God has gifted us to do his work together. All right, so back to the story of the rebuilding of the wall. It's all fun and games for Nehemiah, and then it's not. There are 3 guys who try to stir up the people to thwart the work that Nehemiah and the Jews are doing. Their names are Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem. I'm not sure if this is what they looked like. This is the best cartoon imagery I could find online to help you remember them. But these 3 dudes are governors of the nearby cities around Jerusalem. They were probably afraid that if Jerusalem had its walls rebuilt, it would be stronger and more of a threat to its neighbors. There's a lot of history here that I'm not going to go into, but suffice it to say, they weren't happy, and they wanted to stop the good work that Nehemiah was leading. So let's read a little bit more of the story. When Sanballat heard that they were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and was greatly incensed. He ridiculed the Jews, and in the presence of his associates and the army of Samaria, he said, "What are those feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from those heaps of rubble, burned as they are?" And Tobiah the Ammonite, who was at his side, said, my favorite line, "What they are building, even a fox climbing up on it would break down their wall of stones." So Sanballat and Tobiah start off by mocking the Jews and trying to thwart their confidence in the work that God had given them to do. Later, and I'm not going to read it, but they go into other tactics of distraction and eventually just flat out lies to try to pull Nehemiah and the people away from the good work God had called them to. I imagine it would have been really tempting for Nehemiah and the people to give in to these ploys. They probably wanted to fight back. They wanted to wipe these leaders out and then come back to doing the building work. And the enemies of the good work were relentless in their pursuit of thwarting the work of God. So how do Nehemiah and the Jews respond? Probably shouldn't be a surprise to us by now, but they turn to God in prayer. So I'm going to read the prayer that they pray now. It says, "Hear us, our God, for we are despised. Turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them over as plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults in the face of the builders. So we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height, for the people worked with all their heart. So the wall was completed on the 25th of Elul in 52 days. When all our enemies heard about this, all the surrounding nations were afraid and lost their self-confidence, because they realized that this work had been done with the help of our God." So Nehemiah doesn't give in to what his enemies want. He prays what is referred to in the world of theology as an imprecatory prayer. I heard a pastor once say that these are the prayers that say, "Get 'em, God." Nehemiah doesn't deny the injustice that's being done to him and his people, and he doesn't ignore it. Instead, Nehemiah knows his place, and he knows God's place, and Nehemiah stays in his proper place. He asks God to hold the people accountable for the sins they've committed and the harm they've done. And Nehemiah stays focused. The opposition tries to get them to step away from his work and to talk to them. He doesn't. He doesn't go and try to win them over or reason with them or defend himself. He stays exactly where he is, despite the 4 attempts to pull him away. And what's the end result? They finish the wall. According to that verse 15 that you see there, it takes them 52 days, which might seem like a long time, but they were lifting the stones by hand, so I'm going to give them a pass on that. I think 52 days is pretty good. Eventually, the enemies of God lose their self-confidence, and they see that God was with Nehemiah and the people the whole time. Justice eventually comes, and Nehemiah doesn't have to take it into his own hands. All right, so the last takeaway here is that Nehemiah trusts God to handle his enemies, and he stays focused on his work. And this is kind of a hard question, but as you think about your work, who are the Sanballats and Tobiahs? The people who are hard to work with, who try to distract you, who tear other people down. And how can you trust God by staying focused despite opposition? I would encourage you to give those people over to God. Trust that God is doing justice, and stay focused on what God has for you. I also think it's helpful as we think about these Sanballats and Tobiahs in our work to remember that they're probably experiencing the ordinary nature of work just like we are, and the hard parts and the challenges, but they're probably dealing with it in a different way than you might, or than we know we can when we have God with us in the building and rebuilding of our day-to-day work. So by staying focused on our work and showing those around us what it looks like to work alongside God, we represent the gospel even to the coworkers who are the hardest to love. All right, so we've been through a big story today, the story of Nehemiah. So let's recap a little bit. Nehemiah faces a fire drill of a dire situation with the burnt down walls of Jerusalem. He prays, he prepares to go before the king, and he makes an ask to support the work he needs to do. Nehemiah's request is granted, so he goes off to Jerusalem to start the rebuilding project. People from all these different day jobs come alongside him to do their work together. But it's not all smooth sailing. The nearby governors oppose his work and don't want to see the Jews be successful in the work that they're doing. So they mock them and they try to distract them. But Nehemiah and the people stay focused on the work God has for them. And ultimately, God's way prevails, and they finish the work on the wall despite human opposition. So I'd encourage you to read the whole story of Nehemiah. It's a good one. I just pulled out some pieces here, but I want to wrap up by talking about how this isn't just an Old Testament story. I think sometimes it can be hard to connect with things from 445 BC, but the same concepts of working for God remain true even in the New Testament. So I'm going to end with one of my favorite verses about work, and that's Colossians 3:23 and 24. And it says, "Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you're serving." So what does working for the Lord look like for you when you go to work tomorrow? Maybe it looks like praying over your work, either in a planful way tonight before you go to work tomorrow, or in a spontaneous way when you're heading into a difficult patient's room at the hospital. If you want to pray with someone, we always have a prayer team member in the back during worship. I think it's Luke today. So take them up on it. Our prayer team would love to pray with you about your work. Maybe for you, working for God looks like practicing servant leadership, showing empathy to your coworkers, and inspiring others to join the team and use their gifts to be part of something bigger than themselves. Or maybe you're in a tough situation with a coworker who's making your work difficult, and you need to seek God for justice and stay focused on the task at hand. Whatever it is, know that God gets it. After all, God was the builder of the whole world. He sees how it's torn apart by evil, and he sent Jesus to do something about it. Jesus was a literal builder. He was a carpenter by trade, and he is also a metaphorical builder who's rebuilding everything that's been broken through his life, death, and resurrection. And one day, Jesus is going to come again and fully restore all things. So next, we're going to be transitioning into a time of communion and worship through song and prayer. Everyone who believes in Jesus is welcome to participate with us in communion. You don't have to be a member of Resurrection City to take communion with us. And again, there will be someone in the back to pray for you, and they'd love to pray with you about your work. So as we transition to this time, I'm going to pray a simple prayer from this verse in Colossians. God, today I just want to pray out of Colossians 3, that in whatever we do, we would work at it with all our heart, as working for you, Lord, and not for human masters, knowing that we will receive an inheritance from you, Lord, as our reward. It is you who we are serving. Amen.